Okay, so we have 3 letters today. If we don't get through them, we'll, take extra time next week. You read all 3. Do we have a chance to read them?
Yes.
Okay. So let's start off hot, right out of the gate. Did Paul write them? What do you think? What are your thoughts? And as my teacher in grade school used to say, you must give evidence for your answer. I don't want a yes or no. Give some evidence for your answer, okay? Yeah, Lynn.
Very personal stuff. Some wine, and there was something else I was just reading in 2 Timothy.
Bring his coat, bring his
Yeah,
parchments.
exactly. His scrolls, yes.
Mhm.
Like, why, if somebody were gonna forge it, why would they put that stuff in there?
Yeah, great point. Yeah, over here, Mark.
Timothy 1, the role of men and women in the church, and in that detail. I would have thought that if Paul had written this, that we would have seen it earlier in some of his other letters. I mean, just the whole issue is about, women should be seen and not heard, and dress nicely, and sit in the corner and not talk, and that kind of stuff. I mean, to that level, I never had seen anything earlier in his writings, anything like that. So,
While we're on that, bless you. While we're on that, so the only place that comes close to that is in 1 Corinthians. And we talked about that place where Paul is talking about speaking in tongues in 1 Corinthians. I believe it's 1 Corinthians 9, but we're going to take a peek just to be sure I'm right there. No, that's not right. It's the only place where Paul sounds like he's talking about, there it is, 1 Corinthians 11. No, that's not it either. Yeah, we have whether women should have their hair out or not. We have that part. Husband's head of Christ is head of the church. Husband's head of the wife. God is head of the Christ. So that's the only place where we get something close to it. But we also have this part about women being silent, where he's clearly talking about speaking in tongues, and it's very likely that it was added into the text and not him, because you have this direct line of speaking in tongues, and then you have this insertion of women, and I'm going to find it here before. But anyway, that is a place that certainly gets looked at.
It's 14.
Yeah,
14, like
to 20.
34-ish, or 29,
34.
34.
Thank you. All right, 14. Yeah, let's take a look at that.
33 to
In my notes,
36.
they did Paul really.
Yeah, there we go. 30. Yeah, it is 33
Is there something
to.
like right above that? It was talked about women who are prophesying and all this stuff. Well, that's
Right.
so
Right.
That doesn't make sense.
Right. It doesn't make sense to the text in 1 Corinthians that would be there, because it's contrary to what Paul's already said. And so I think, to Mark's point, this isn't in Paul's other writings, and the way he talks about women should be seen, not heard, and won't allow them to have leadership. Well, in all his other letters, there are women who are leaders and are partners with him in ministry. And by the way, he says they're equal, male and female in Christ. So it actually seems to go against what Paul has preached or taught the churches in the other direction. But then we have what Willyn said. We have very personal details. Seems to know the people very closely, knows how they're feeling, knows they know where to find things in wherever he was staying. So, okay, so those are 2 great examples, pro and against. Others? Let me hear from the rest of you. Anybody else have?
Just the way he talks, it's different.
Aha.
He's stronger to me in this. He's more wishy-washy.
And do you think that all three of the letters that you read are similar in voice? Do you think all three of these were written by the same person? Paul or not?
Right.
I hear a no over here,
Not
a
in
no
the
over
frame of
here.
mind.
This corner says no. This over here says no. Pam says no. What makes you say that you think it might be two different authors?
It's just a change in the way it's written and the way it comes across.
The
It's-
tone?
That's why I felt it was changing. And it seems very strong in First Timothy.
Mm.
This is it, and that's all concrete, and I never felt that way in his other letters. That he
Mhm.
was- And I thought, maybe he's just older and smarter, I don't know.
Yeah.
More experience.
Sure, sure.
But you said he didn't write the letters. Somebody
Well,
wrote, he,
I s-
why didn't he write his own letters?
So, all right, let's go back to possibilities. So, there are two schools of thought. One that Paul wrote them, and that they're authentic to Paul, and one that others wrote them in his name. Pseudographical, with somebody who is a disciple of him, very much like we read in the Gospel of John. These are the words of the one who paid witness, and I am sharing those words with you now. I'm not him, but if you look at the end of the Gospel of John, I'm not John, but I'm writing his words so that you may know who Christ is. So a lot of biblical scholars say, well, okay, this could be Silas or Barnabas or John Mark writing Paul's accounts. And that's a reason why the tone is different, because it's still Paul telling them, hey, this is what I want you to write. But then you have others who say, now wait a minute. I mean, that's possible. I guess he could be telling somebody to write and he knows personal details. But then why is he telling, Timothy to take some wine for his poor tummy? And why is he telling Titus to grab his things out of storage? If he doesn't know these people, if it's not Paul. Okay. Other reasons why people think he wrote it or did not. So another big reason why the arguments against Paul are, you have particularly in 2 Timothy. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a little bit, but I just want to get on some of these big themes. 2 Timothy. Hold on. You have a very different hierarchy of church, 1 and 2 Timothy. So you have talks about deacons, elders. It's clear that the church has a structure of organization and leadership that it doesn't seem to have. None of these terms are mentioned in Romans, Galatians, Corinthians, Philippians, etc. Now, those who say Paul did write them say, well, a lot can happen in 10 years. They could have gotten organized in 10 years, and this is the structure they had. Who's to say they couldn't have done that in 10 years? Very much possible. Maybe a more compelling argument is the actual words that are used in these letters themselves. And somewhere in the notes I sent you the exact word count. Here it is. There's 902 words, individual words, in the 3 pastoral letters. Outside of proper names, you got 848 words. 306 of those never occur in any of Paul's other writings. Over almost 40% of them doesn't exist in anything Paul writes at all. It's not his normal vocabulary. But maybe more powerful is a lot of the themes or normal languages that Paul continues to go to are also not found in the pastoral letters. Christ is referred to as King, more so than Lord Christos. Paul uses cross and crucify all the time, and never in the pastorals. I mean, the crucified Christ is, that's where Paul's always making his bread and butter. He doesn't speak about him at all. Now, maybe these are personal letters to a person, that's why they're called pastoral, to a personal guy. Go take care of this conflict in Ephesus, handle this, and maybe doesn't need to talk theology as much. It just seems a little strange. That's why I'm just giving you reasons why there's a debate about authorship of these letters. And then you have the historical narrative, all right? So one other possibility. So you have guys like Irenaeus and Clement of Alexandria, Polycarp of Rome, who say Paul wrote these letters. They're, 2nd century church leaders. We know Paul wrote these letters. But then a lot of the terms in the letters come from the 2nd century, and we don't have them not only in the Bible, but we don't have them in any 1st century writings. So terms that are, later vernacular terms, now does that mean they, I'm just telling you what is archaeologically true. All right, does that make sense? Okay, so it's not a landslide argument one way or the other. There's good arguments both ways. All right. Other questions about any of that before we... Yes, please, Pam.
So, this is so important because of Paul's credibility versus the other writers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And the biggest thing is what happens when... So if the pastoral letters are Paul's, did he have a change in what he believed? Which is very possible. You and I probably have, your faith doesn't stay in one place. It moves, it's challenged, it grows. So you might not believe exactly what you believed at 10 years old about God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. I hope not. Maybe questions and growth, you think about things, you have different experiences in your faith, and things are challenged. It could be that Paul's belief about some things changed, and this is a progression of them in his letters. But there are those moments, particularly with the treatment of women, with how you should treat somebody when they're out of line. In 1 Timothy, it says, hand them over to Satan, which is very similar to 1 Corinthians, by the way. In 2 Timothy, it says, be gentle with this guy. Don't have, avoid being close with them, but don't, be careful with some of these opponents. But instead of just casting them off to the devil, you're supposed to, in love, like Christ in his sufferings, you're supposed to love your enemies through the suffering they put on you. And you might say, well, it could be both of those things, very much like it seemed in 1 and 2 Corinthians. That's why I say it's not, it's kind of clear as mud. But if it's 1 and 2 Timothy, and it's the same, writing to the same person that you're instructing, it would seem that you'd give them one set of instructions, and it would be clear, and you wouldn't change boats midstream and tell them, this is how you should handle this, when you've already told them, you should kick this guy out. Does that make sense?
So is this used as an argument? In other words, no, I don't believe women should be treated this way in the church because I don't believe Paul wrote this.
So,
Great question. That's where we're going to go next on Jennifer.
so who are they saying wrote these letters?
Well, the other portion of the church that doesn't believe that they are authentically Paul believes that either a disciple of Paul wrote them, So somebody who was either alive with Paul, a contemporary, one of the people who went on his missionary journeys, hence would have familiarity with Timothy, maybe is also friends with Timothy, and is either writing after Paul has died, hence the 2nd century language, or is writing them while Paul is in prison and can't get things out, or that somebody's writing in Paul's name after him and his contemporaries are dead.
But there are no names.
We don't know. Yeah. Now, before you say that's crazy, I would point to all the Gnostic Gospels. The Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot's not writing anything. He's dead. But it's the Gospel of Judas Iscariot. He didn't write it, but it's a common ancient practice to have that. So,
But if they're personal letters that are about, drink the wine or bring me my coat,
mhm.
that seems bizarre that would be written a century later because, or even if Timothy was still alive, if that letter was, that doesn't make sense.
It would not make sense that it is somebody, as far as for some of the people who are saying it's late 2nd century, the letter, you're right, wouldn't make sense that unless Timothy's living, Timothy's a lot younger than Paul.
Yeah.
But, Paul has known Timothy, it's like a confirmation. Paul has known Timothy since he's a boy, right? He talks about his grandmother and his mother. But again, that familiarity. So I'm just going to give you my take on it. This is like Paul saying, this is not according to Jesus or Scripture, this is according to me. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing. I don't think Paul wrote 1 Timothy. I do think Paul might have wrote 2 Timothy. If you listen to the tone and the familiarity, the tone of the letter sounds very much like his other letters. The language is different. Titus, I'm not sure. I'm neutral on Titus. But the reason I don't think Paul wrote 1 Timothy is the theology is different than other Paul's writings, significantly different. I think, unless Paul was talking about a specific group of women doing specific things in the church of Ephesus, which I don't think it sounds like. I mean, it sounds like that's part of the problem, but it sounds like whoever's writing this believes this universally. And so in the language of it, the theology of it, just does not seem Pauline to me. I read the other letters, I read that one. 2 Timothy and 1 Timothy, to me, don't seem like they're written by the same person. But that's my take. Other people would call me heretical for that take.
So if Timothy, I'm sorry, you go ahead, I'm so sorry.
I should say, in 2 Timothy, I mean, he was towards the end of his life, and it's just like he is really lonely.
Yeah.
I mean, he's lonely, he's talking about how I fought the good fight. I mean,
He's saying
it's like,
I don't think I'm going to get out of here.
end times.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to get out of here.
And I think a lot of what he says here was that affected by him feeling like, I'm not going to get out of this one alive.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It was just so, telling Timothy, come on down, because I really want to see you. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just very...
Yeah.
But he's in his 60s too, which is probably pretty old for that day, right?
Yeah.
At this point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he's in prison. And the other piece of this is, so according to tradition, Paul is arrested, Caesarea Philippi. He appeals to the emperor. He's taken to Rome. Standing trial for capital punishment, potentially, for being seditious to Rome, but he has appealed to the emperor, who at the time is Nero. The church tradition is that Nero kills Paul, and that's the end, and the church continues as Paul's a martyr. However, there are those who believe that Paul somehow got out of that, was paroled, went to Spain, and in that third missionary journey of Paul, the pastorals are written. All right? There's some phrasing. If you read the notes I sent out, there's some phrasing on why people believe that. The biggest argument against that is most times when, like, Peter is in Rome, or the belief that Mary Magdalene and the Holy Grail, the Shroud of Turin, all these things. Anytime there's an artifact or any kind of association with any of the early disciples, a town would claim it. Ephesus. You go to Ephesus on a tour today, they say, Mary and John the disciple, this is where they stayed. This is their house. Right? There's nothing like that in Spain about Paul. Why don't they claim it if he was there? Not... So... Anyway, these, you could... People have made careers out of debating this stuff. In the end, really, we want to focus on content. What are the letters saying? Who are they writing to, and why does it matter? So we're going to do that for now. I'm just painting for you a little bit of the church debate. It does depend on Paul's credibility a bit. The bigger issue is that when we come to a place in Timothy where it says all Scripture is God-breathed, and again, that's meaning the Hebrew Bible, because there's no New Testament. All right, but then people are taking 1st and 2nd Timothy as canon, as inerrant. And if it's inerrant, then you have a book that says women should be silent in church and they can't be leaders. So you have a portion of Christians who say women can't be pastors, women can't be bishops, women can't teach Sunday school in some churches because of those texts. And they certainly can't talk in church. So again, making a letter doctrinal for the whole of faith universally, that's where you get some of the ripple effects over the years of, well, Paul wrote this, and this is how the church is supposed to be. So you get some legacies, whether you like them or not, they exist. Southern Baptist Convention. Women are allowed to be pastors. They were until the 1970s, by the way. The Catholic Church, women can't be priests. Why? Well, it's in there. That's so. Does it matter? Yeah, it matters a lot to a lot of people. And so we have some of those legacies. Let's go to 1 Timothy, and we'll dig into each letter on their own. Okay? Let me get through these arguments of writing and get to the actual text. Okay. So, we have in 1 Timothy, get to the right book before we start talking about it. Okay. Paul is writing to Timothy, who is he's sending to Ephesus. What do we know about Paul's time in Ephesus? Well, we know something from the book of Acts, when we read the book of Acts, that when Paul went to Ephesus on his journey through Acts 16, he goes and he speaks at Derbe and Lystra and Iconium and Ephesus, and which is in modern-day Turkey. And they don't treat Paul and his entourage well. In fact, Paul, let's just turn to Acts 16 very quickly so that we can just have a little refresher course and a connection point between
That's what?
Acts 16. Okay. Paul takes in 16:3, he takes Timothy with him. So Timothy has familiarity with these church bodies. And we find out there that Timothy's dad is Greek. Mother is Jewish, so he's the churches are doing well, but they run into some trouble later, and we see that in 16 they have the problem with the slave girl crying out. I think I spoke about this last time. They seize Paul and Silas from the marketplace. They jail them. The magistrates, there's some problems with the city council in Thyatira. So as they're on this trip to the region around Ephesus, to Derbe, to Thyatira, they run into some strong opposition. And what is going to happen is the leaders of the church of Ephesus are going to come in, and they're going to be teaching some things about Jesus that Paul says are wrong, or whoever wrote this letter. And so Paul wants Timothy to go and set the record straight and tell them, you'll see that if we go back to 1 Timothy, he talks about this trip to Macedonia from Acts, that these people in verse 4, not to occupy themselves with myths and endless genealogies, promoting speculations rather than divine training that is known by faith. If the aim of such instruction is love that comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, a sincere faith. But verse 6, some people have deviated from these and turned to meaningless talk, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they're saying or the things with which they make assertions. Now we find out later that as Paul tunes this in, or whoever wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy tunes it in, and says that in 2 Timothy, some people are preaching that the resurrection has already happened, and they're living in this, the second coming has already arrived. So they don't have to wait for anything. It's already here. Paul said, no. The whole genealogy business sounds a lot, we don't have a lot of information on this, but it sounds a lot like what the Gnostics write about in their text, to talk about Jesus' origins. Some of the Gnostics then talk about Jesus' mission being that of teaching people, bringing people knowledge, but then what really matters there, what would matter to Paul certainly, would be that the cross and resurrection aren't really central to Christianity. It's really what Jesus teaches and the knowledge he bestows. The significance of his death really isn't as important, or the fact that he rose from the dead, which Paul certainly would have had major issue with. And so Paul, it doesn't come out and say that, but based on some of the things that he says kind of in the fringes about what these people are doing, makes it sound like, and from some of his other letters, he talks about Gnostic teachings. Other writings of the New Testament talk about Gnostic teachings. Certainly the further you go along into the 2nd century, late 1st century, those opponents and different variations of Christianity are going to be more present. So it makes sense that this is there, but Paul's basically saying, go set this straight. Any questions so far about anything yet? Okay. So here's a place where, like 117, to the King of the ages, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. That kind of title, like Paul's very similar in his other writings about Christ as Lord, Christ as Son of God. This title of Jesus is not, could he have written a different way of describing Jesus? Absolutely he could have. But it's another one of those phrases that is foreign to any of his other writings. So do with it what you will. He goes through and is talking about how then in chapter 2. That's really where a lot of the controversial pieces, I'm sorry, let's stay in 1. He names 2 people specifically, Hymenaeus and Alexander, as 2 of the leaders that are causing the discord in the church. And then he'll also talk about the coppersmith in the second letter to Timothy. And people to beware of, be wary of, that are kind of causing these problems in the church. Now, if you listen to the Bible Project this week, they couched chapter 2 as these women of wealth are hearing these 2 guys and their false teachings, and then the women are speaking in church and perpetuating these narratives that Paul thinks are dangerous. But the text doesn't actually say that. It says that they're dressing in ways that are distracting to the guys, and Paul's nervous about that, or whoever's writing it. And then that they should just be quiet. But it doesn't say that they're with the dangerous teachings, or that they're teaching dangerous teachings. It just says they should be quiet. And then you get into a really interesting piece. So we have verse 12, I permit no women to teach or have authority over man. She's to keep silent. And then the theological basis of that for this writer is verse 13. Adam was formed first and then Eve. Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. This is an exact opposite of what we read in Romans, where Paul says, through one man was the fall, Adam, and through one man will be redeemed, Christ. But he puts it on Adam as the one who is blamed for the fall. Here, Adam has no responsibility. It's all Eve's fault. And so that's why she's less. And that's why, theologically, she can't have authority over man in the church. I can't believe Paul would write that. Because he even writes about being taught by Phoebe and Junia, who are apostles who he says are equal to him. Well, how can he see them as equal to him if he doesn't permit them to have a leadership role? It doesn't make any sense. So that's why I say, for me, 1 Timothy is a real struggle, because it goes against some of Paul's other writings. It's not just that it sounds different than Paul. It's that the writer is saying something that Paul doesn't say. Paul says something different, and actually the opposite of what 1 Timothy says. That's why I struggle with 1 Timothy as being Pauline.
There was a phrase that jumped out at me as being odd, where when he mentions Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have turned over to Satan.
Yeah.
Doesn't that seem very harsh and opposite of what he would have normally?
It's a great, so you're right to point out that sentence. And the thing that jumps off that page to me is, so that they may learn not to blaspheme. Is it possible that Paul's charging with blasphemy and it's actually Paul? Yeah, but and it makes sense with how they're portraying Christ. But, so on the one hand you have, like I said in 1 Corinthians, Paul tells them to leave him to Satan, the guy who's sleeping with his father's wife, his stepmother. And he says, hand that one over to Satan, that same kind of phrase. And then later in 2 Corinthians it says, and I was too harsh with you, you should bring this guy in. So he kind of waffles on it. But the idea of Paul never mentions blasphemy anywhere else in any of his letters. Now, he's a Pharisee, certainly believes in blasphemy. But that phrase as a punishment just jumped off the page at me as well.
So what does that mean if you hand them over to Satan? Like, you ostracize them, you just
Yeah.
send them out and...
Have nothing to do with them
Okay.
until they come back repentant. If you've heard of the Amish communities, there's shunning. That's that practice, yeah.
The women will be saved through childbearing.
Yeah, so that's verse 15.
What does that mean?
If they continue in faith, love, and holiness.
Yeah, so here we have, in 1 Timothy, I think we just have honestly, I think you have a faith leader, whoever wrote this book, had very different opinions on the holy abilities of the genders. And they were not equal to whoever wrote this book. Men were here, and women were here. Women have to be submissive, had to be under the teaching and authority of the man, period. And the role was raise the kids. But don't be talking in church, don't be leading in church. You got nothing to say. And before we say that's ancient thinking, didn't a Chiefs football player just get into some major hot water in a Catholic commencement speech by saying, now, he was trying to express his faith that his wife had a beautiful role as a mom and as a wife, but it came out, and maybe he thinks this way. It sounds like he does. He was trying to, I think, edify being a mom is a great vocation, which it is, and being a wife can be a beautiful thing. But the idea that women should stay in the kitchen, which was what he said, is a real slap to recognition of the gift and potential of the majority of people in our country who happen to have X chromosome and not Y, and the accomplishments of women and the leadership of women, and my gosh, the things that women offer in the world.
That's kind of an old Catholic way of looking at things, too.
It is. So, but where do they get that kind of stuff? Well, through a literal interpretation of texts like this, you can build a very strong. Now, I'm not trying to say I'm anti-family values, but I am trying to say that a woman can't have a voice. I mean, just think of the loss in the traditions. Do we really think it's healthy? I'm sorry to my Catholic brothers and sisters who may be listening, because I also grew up Catholic. But do you think it really serves the Catholic Church well? And you look at all the problems in the priesthood today that forbids priests from marrying, from being dads, from having women as priests. You think about the voice that's lost. You think about the value of men and women in the church body before God. I mean, go back to Genesis. God created them in God's image, male and female. In God's image. And as Karen points out when we studied, Karen Nottigal points out when we studied Genesis, I mean, this writer theologically is blaming Eve. Eve wasn't there when God gave the instructions what trees you can eat. Only Adam got the instructions. Eve takes the fruit first, but Adam's standing right there. They're both cursed and punished. They both are reprimanded. They both blame each other. So to put the blame on one theologically and say it's all her fault, my gosh. Okay. Pass the Tylenol. Okay. One of the reasons I'm not a biblical literist, but it's pretty tough. It's pretty tough, I think, for some to deal with these texts in particular. Can we move on a little bit? Or do you want to stay there?
But
Please,
it's just
go
the
ahead, Lynn.
saving part. I mean, I can get all that stuff, that it's good for the woman to be a mother and all that, but saved, not accepting Jesus as her savior.
Right.
But having a baby, you have a baby and you're saved no matter what you do or what you believe. I mean, that sounds kind of weird.
Pastor, do the Mormons believe that, right?
Yeah, I mean,
Strongly.
yeah, it's, yes. So when people ask questions about salvation and say, well, you have to pray this prayer and confess, like it says in Acts, and every knee shall bow. I say, well, unless you're reading 1 Timothy, and then you can be saved through having a kid. Or if you're reading Luke or Matthew's gospel, and Jesus says, not everybody who says Lord, Lord, if you haven't done for my brother and sister who is naked or sick or hungry or in prison, you're going to depart into eternal, not eternal bliss. You're taking the left door. And so, do I think this means quite literally through bearing a child you'll have a place in heaven? Yeah, I do think that author believes this. Because, look at the description of women otherwise in this text. It's pretty, it's pretty clear.
So where does that leave a woman who has no child?
Yeah, I was just gonna.
Submissive, follow the guy, be a godly woman. But it's a great question. It comes down to, is the ability. We could take the same kind of. Now I'm going to go back to Paul a little bit. Remember when we talked about Paul's dialogue in 1 Corinthians 7 about, again, context is really important. Jesus is coming back now. So Paul tells the young people who are engaged, don't set a date for the wedding, don't get married. It's better to stay celibate. Remember all this? But Paul's not trying to create lifelong instructions for people. Paul's thinking Jesus is coming moments from now, a year from now, tops. So these things are inconsequential to the second coming of Christ. Don't set a wedding date because you got to be focused and you got to be in the moment because Jesus is arriving and Jesus is calling us to be focused. Now later in life, he doesn't have such a hard line. He later in his books, it's, we're not sure how it's going to look. But, Paul's only his reason for getting married, if you can't keep your hormones in check, go ahead and get married. That's basically what he says. If your biological urges to have sex are going to cause you to sin, then get married, for God's sake. Don't live in sin. But we would hardly call that a sexual ethic of doctrine for the church to live by, right? And if you can't procreate, is that the only reason why people engage in intercourse? No. Read the Song of Songs. We talked about the Song of Songs. Of course not. So, but it's a great question if you're going to read it all literally. What about people who can't have children? What about people who are, menopause, past menopause? Does that mean now that no sex is God-given? Is it only for procreation? So yes, we're getting down the rabbit hole, but you're asking great questions. You're asking great questions. Great questions. So, and this is where a lot of debate comes in around this book, because there's a lot at stake if you say that Scripture is inerrant and this is teaching meant for the church doctrinally. Then you can't omit it, you can't ignore it. So, we just had this happen last Sunday. Somebody came to church, it was a visitor. I'm going to say this. Somebody came to church on Sunday and came up to our other pastor, Pastor Michelle, and said, I want to see the pastor. And she said, I'm right here. What can I do for you? And they said, no, the real pastor.
Ouch.
It was a visitor?
It was a visitor, yeah.
Yeah.
And his tradition was only the men are pastors. So whatever robes or not, whatever she wasn't a minister. Now, we don't believe that. But, again, that's the stakes. Much to the church's loss when that happens. To the church's loss. And there's a lot of woundedness around it.
What would he have done if it was Michelle and Karen that day?
I don't know.
Would he have stayed or?
I don't know.
If you take a look at a lot of these, the roles of men and women in the church, a lot of it is the current churches, it's Catholics and the other denominations that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. But then you have like Oak Creek and Cornerstone. I know years past when we went to Cornerstone on a visit with the young people, they didn't allow women in leadership positions. Mm-hmm. mean, that was the late 1990s, and I'm thinking to myself, there's still churches around that are newer churches that in Chicago suburbs,
Yeah.
you know, that do that, which and it's a large denomination, which really surprised me.
Yeah.
The mega church, and they don't have
Some
women
do,
lead-
some don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll go along a little bit further. So in chapter 3, we really get that development of ecclesiology, of the church, of bishops, and it gives, it gives some very strong instruction. A leader who's going to be a leader of the church, and not drunk all the time, takes care of their family, honest, trustworthy, responsible, not violent, not materialistic. And basically, if they can't keep track of their own household, how can they keep track of a church? So, and then you have this distinction between bishop or elder is the term, and deacon. And a lot of churches are set up this way. Presbytery, you have elders and deacons. Same with the Methodist Church. Same with the Catholic Church, priests and deacons, and different roles, different offices of the church. And in that same kind of way. And then it goes into family, how people then should be in families. Older women, younger women, how they should carry it, not be a, blameless, not be slanderous, etc. All those kinds of instructions to, and the point of this is that the witness to the world, you have to look different, you have to be different and not play by the rules of culture around you. You have to stand out and let your faith conviction show in a way that says there are things you will not do because of your faith, which are good things. I mean, those are good instructions. I mean, if everything's okay, then if you don't stand for anything, you can fall for anything. But it talks about older women, younger women, how they should treat each other, younger men, older men. Kind of these words of encouragement in chapter 4. Then widows. And I find this text also really interesting. So chapter 5. It appears that some people are pretending to be widows to their advantage, to get help in the church. Because you read in 5, 3 through basically 16, he emphasizes you got to make sure these women are really widows. About 7 times he talks about, if they have children or not. If they're a real widow, she should do this. Verses 5 and 6. And he's got all these rules around whether or not a widow can be on the list of people to be helped by the church. Clearly there's something going on here where some situation is going on that some women are taking advantage of the church's generosity that the writer of this text is upset about. Because there's a lot of emphasis on, and look at where it goes. Verse 11 on, he says he's not going to put if you're a younger widow, right? A younger widow, you're still in a situation that's kind of dire. But he says here, I refuse to put younger widows on the list because their sensual desires may alienate them from Christ and they will want to marry, and so they incur condemnation for having violated their first pledge. And then because they're sitting around, they learn to be idle gadflies who are gossips and busybodies. I mean, man.
What happens when you don't want to be leaders?
Yeah.
Or maybe Paul needed to get married.
Yeah.
9,000, I thought, really? They knew busybodies?
So it's a gossip. It's a gossip and somebody who's loose with their. But I mean, so on the one hand, in all seriousness, there very much could be a report that there are women who are causing a lot of problems. And he's writing of a very specific thing. But again, the flip side of the coin is, if we take the measure from the pastorals, that all scripture is God-breathed and without errancy, then if it's doctrinal, if it goes from being a letter to doctrine, then that kind of portrayal of women can easily slip into universal kind of thinking, and it's just not very flattering of anybody who's female in the church at all. If you take it, that's why, again, I say this a lot, it's so important to look at the context of what a writing is written and what the writer is trying to talk to and about. So we have a lot of, the church has a widow crisis. Not that the widows are lonely and hurting, they probably are, but there's some problem with the young widows apparently, causing problems, and who can be on the list and who can't, and he wants Timothy to give some very specific instructions and quiet the rumor mill for these women who are causing problems. So tell them to be quiet, go home, and when they're home, don't perpetuate a lot of loose talk.
I like that, because that says that there's women that they want to be in control, no matter what they're saying in here. They're gonna be,
It could be that the women are just out of hand, and they don't. The guys don't like that they're having had a voice. It could be that too.
You see it now.
Yeah, it could
Some
be the
women
boys
want their
do it.
control.
Yeah. So, we do have this admonition to drink only water, take a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments. In verse 23, that very kind of personal thing. So is it on the one hand, you'd think, okay, that's a personal thing for Paul knowing Timothy, but it could be anybody in Paul's group who also knows Timothy. Right? If they know him, they know him. And let's face it, not everybody, if you had all of us write a letter on behalf of, to the Church of Naperville from the brothers and sisters of First Congregational, and you had 10 people in this church write a letter about a topic, you're going to have very different voices and opinions, right? So
we write this letter, and it's to the Church of Naperville.
Mhm.
Well, it's not for any other church. It's just these people have to do what we're writing for them to do.
right.
As this is here, this is not for everybody, so why should people take what is in there and say this is the way things have to be?
It's a great point. We're going to get to that in just a second as we get into 2 Timothy. Okay. You get two last things on 1 Timothy before we close off. You've maybe heard the phrase, we bring nothing into the world, we take nothing with us. That's found in 1 Timothy. It's also found in the book of Job. You brought nothing in. Naked you come into this world, and naked you're going out of it.
I like 6:10. I didn't know that was even.
The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, which mirrors what a saying of Jesus.
Yeah.
We do have in verse 9, just before it, people who are rich falling into temptation are trapped by senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. So that part of the Bible Project video, where clearly people with some influence and power and wealth are causing problems and perpetuating things about Jesus that the writer disagrees with. It's also interesting then that the very criteria for leadership in chapter 4, there's no power, there's no wealth, so anybody who he's been talking about, you don't qualify as a leader of the church, right? The last thing that really stands out to me in this letter, that is unique to this letter and unique to the Bible, is chapter 6, verse 13. In the presence of God, who gives life to all things, and of Christ Jesus, who in his testimony before Pontius Pilate made the good confession, I charge you, keep the commandment without spot or blame until the manifestation of our Lord Jesus Christ. What was Christ's confession to Pilate? The synoptics tell us Jesus didn't say anything. Only the Gospel of John, when he has that dialogue with Pilate about what is true. So either the writer's taking something from the understanding of the Gospel of John, or there's another tradition about what Jesus said that we don't have. The confession. Love to know what that's about. Don't know what that's about, but it's in there. Okay? All right. 2 Timothy. How we doing? How we doing on time? Are we like 10 minutes left? Or?
4 minutes.
It's 5:25. You got to be kidding me. All right. Do we have 10, folks? Do we have 10? We're not going to touch Titus. That would be unfair to Titus. We'll come back to Titus. 2 Timothy. Very different animal. We have, again, I said this is why I think 2 Timothy to me sounds Pauline, is that you have language of fighting the good fight, running the good race, mirrors 1 Corinthians. You have him talking about John Mark. You have him talking about Tychius and and Demas and some of the very specific people, Prisca and Aquila, people that Paul mentions frequently in his other letters that he's with. He tells him to go to the house, bring his parchment. He's talking about dying, but he's still got things to say, which to me, like he paints this picture of this jail cell. He might not make it out of there. Goes so much along with these things that he writes in 2 Corinthians, I was regarded as an imposter, yet I'm true. I've faced all this adversity, and yet I have everything. That kind of sentiment, that kind of passion aligns perfectly with how this letter ends. And so to me, the personality of this letter sounds a heck of a lot like Paul. You don't have, you have differences between 1 and 2 Timothy where just the language itself between the two letters, it's same topic, same person, same church, but the tone, the language are different. So anyway, some other pieces about 2 Timothy. Other things about 2 Timothy you had questions about that you had. Otherwise, I'm going to just do some highlights on it. Okay. We find out in 2 Timothy that Hermogenes and Phygelus are these two that have worked specific named, different than the names that we get in 1 Timothy. So troublemakers, two different troublemakers. And he says to be careful for them. And then he mentions this coppersmith Alexander, in chapter 4, who did him great harm on his trip. And when we read Acts, we remember that there's a metalsmith who Paul is jeopardizing his business of making idols to the Greek and Roman gods, and has him reported to the police and has him arrested and imprisoned. So again, watch out for this guy. But we've heard about this story in Acts, which makes me say, okay, here's somebody that Paul knows very well because he put him in prison. And he said, Timothy, be careful while you're out there. This guy doesn't mean you know. If he's smiling at you, be careful, he might have a dagger to put in your back. He uses the Hebrew Bible in opposition to Moses to talk about opposition he is facing with these two guys in chapter 3, which also Paul, in his authentic writings, goes to Moses a lot, goes to Abraham, uses those figures of Scripture frequently. So there's a lot of things in this letter that I think lend themselves more. Again, The language, the language and the style are a little bit different. A lot of the words don't match the other Pauline letters, but to me, the tone and voice of this letter sound very much like Paul. But I'm not a Paul expert by any stretch. People spend years of their life studying him. I'm just telling you, like, based on these 3 letters, this one stands as different than the other 2 in tone and in voice to me. Other thoughts, questions, comments before we, we'll maybe take 15, if you want to come a little early next week, I'll jump into Titus and we'll take 15 minutes. Maybe if you want to come at 4:15, we'll do Titus and then I'll turn it over to Pastor Michelle as she does our next books. Can you do that? Can we do 4:15? Titus, she's gonna get back into Philemon, which is a great text. But I don't want to. I want to discount Titus because it's a very different book. We get the word "Hey, you Cretan" from Titus. Yeah.
I'm sorry, why did those 2 people think that the Savior had already come? What was that all about?
Good question. We have so around this time and into the early 2nd century, you have all these groups, and we would not have known this without the Nag Hammadi scrolls, which are, you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? And have you heard about the Nag Hammadi scrolls found in Egypt? Anybody? Yes, a few of you. So basically, Dead Sea Scrolls are, a Bedouin kid is throwing rocks. He hears a crack as he throws one into a cave that sounds like a clay pot. He crawls down there and he discovers all these clay vases full of old scrolls that turn out to be thousands of years old parchment of books of the Bible and books that are not in the canon, but are pseudepigraph or apocryphal books. All right, so it's a huge discovery because they compare these texts, which are in many cases intact, all the books of the Bible except for the book of Esther, in one place, and
Only the Old Testament? Or
Hebrew Bible. And as they're looking at that, then they are comparing these texts, which are older than most of the texts that archaeologically we have, and they can compare, handwritten things, how accurate are they? And they turn out to be pretty darn close. And it's a huge discovery because it's how seriously they're taking each of these translations. But that's a big discovery. Nag Hammadi is unique because it's a trash dump, and they're finding partially burnt and buried scrolls from Christian groups that are not Orthodox groups. So what do I mean by that? They have in these writings, this letter to Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel according to Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, you find these writings that teach about the knowledge, gnosis means knowledge in Greek, so that Jesus came to give special secret knowledge to those who would follow him, and that knowledge would set them free. That knowledge would change how they see the world. The knowledge of following Christ would be salvific, not the cross, not the resurrection. So these Gnostic groups who are clearly persecuted, and who, if you read, as we read some of the later books of the New Testament, you see in Revelation, you'll see in Jude, you'll see in Hebrews, some of the attacks against the Gnostics and the things that they're teaching, these false teachings. Here with these guys who say the resurrection has already taken place. Now, there's different Gnostic beliefs. You can't just say that all the Gnostics believe the same thing, broad brush, because they don't. I'm going to give you 2 examples, and then I'm going to have to stop because I know you got things to do. But, for example, one group of Gnostics said, God cannot die. Jesus is God, God's Son. They believed that. But whoever was on the cross was like a stand-in. Somebody who looked like Jesus, or an illusion created by God, but Jesus is still alive. And he never was killed by humanity because God would never suffer God's creation to kill God. So you have a Gnostic group who believes Jesus is God. He's not human. Forget this dual natures of Christ business. He's God. God with us, God's not dying. That's one version of Gnosticism. Another version of Gnosticism says that Jesus was only human. The best of the prophets. He came to bring the knowledge of God, which God infuses in him, but he's not divine because there's only one God, right? So you can't believe that Jesus is also God because that's a blasphemy. So you have different groups of Gnostics that believe different things. Well, we should have a study on the Gnostics, Docetists and Arians and Monasticists and all these guys, these different groups who believe different things about Jesus, all of them at some level circling around the knowledge of Christ, the secret teachings of Christ, and the characters of God, the characteristics of God. A lot of times Gnostics believed in levels of heaven, levels of deities, sub-deities, angels, archangels, tiers of heaven and different aspects of different levels of divine beings, all those kinds of things in certain sects of Gnosticism. So, but they were rooted out. Their books were burned. They were labeled heretics. They were killed by the Orthodox Church, especially as we go into 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. I mean, you believe things that are outside of what the Council of Churches are telling you. And this doesn't end, right? I mean, the Spanish Inquisition and the Huguenots, slaughtering of the Huguenots in France. I mean, you get out of the Anabaptists, you don't believe what the church teaches, and you better hide